Did you know that Grindelwald and Voldemort weren't the only catalysts of wars? There are 8 major eras of war and conflict in the wizarding world. Even lifelong Potterheads don't know about them all. So today, we're breaking them down. From the early clashes that pushed wizards into hiding, to the rebellions the Ministry still tiptoes around, to the post-war tensions everyone forgets actually matter. Before the wizarding world went underground, it spent a few centuries clashing openly with Muggles. Think of it as the trial period before someone finally says, you know what? Let's just hide. This era covers the long stretch of history where magical and non-magical people lived side by side, like dogs and cats, or Star Wars and Star Trek fans. In other words, they didn't get along very well. Muggles feared witchcraft, and wizards weren't too keen on getting burned at the stake. The lack of any central magical authority meant every village was essentially running its own private magical policy. Most conflicts took the form of public hunts, attempted burnings, and retaliatory magic. Wizards routinely escaped execution by using spells such as the Flame Freezing Charm, which made the flames feel like a warm breeze rather than a fatal problem. Over time, the tension escalated into a centuries-long cycle. Muggles tried harder to catch witches, and witches became increasingly creative at not being caught. It's hard to maintain diplomacy when one side is convinced you're consorting with demons, and the other side is quietly wondering whether moving to the forest would simply be less stressful. This period is significant for 2 reasons. Firstly, it sets the foundation for the Statute of Secrecy. In 1692, the magical community collectively decided that disappearing from public life was safer than reliving the Salem witch trials every few months. This meant mandating strict concealment of wizarding existence, magic, and creatures to protect witches and wizards from further persecution and ensure peaceful coexistence, which was then enforced by national ministries of magic. And second of all, it established the first major divide between magical and non-magical societies. These centuries created the cultural and political separation that still shapes the wizarding world in modern times. After several centuries of wizard-muggle hostility, it was finally time for the wizards to peacefully live their lives. Psych! The wizarding world's problems were just getting started, baby. Because the moment wizards solved one problem, another group stepped forward and said, actually, we have some concerns. Enter the goblins. Highly intelligent, extremely organized, cartoonishly obsessed with money to the point of drawing problematic comparisons with real-world prejudices, and absolutely unwilling to let wizards run the world without a few objections. The Goblin Rebellion era refers to a long sequence of uprisings, negotiations, and full-scale conflicts between goblins and the wizarding government. These weren't minor disputes, like when I want to order a pizza for dinner but my partner has her heart set on Chinese food. These were major clashes that collectively form one of the most influential political struggles in magical history. The earliest major revolt in this sequence is the Rebellion of 1612. It took place in Hogsmeade, where goblins turned the Three Broomsticks building into a makeshift command center. Details about individual leaders are scarce, but surviving accounts describe a coordinated movement with enough organization to worry the ministry. Wizards eventually suppressed the uprising, but the political frustrations behind it remained completely unaddressed. A fantastic long-term strategy, as always. Several mid-17th century uprisings followed. These weren't recorded with the precision of a modern historian, but class notes from History of Magic paint a clear pattern. Goblins demanded legal reforms, the ministry refused, the goblins rebelled, and the cycle repeated. Some of these uprisings reportedly involved goblins aligning with werewolves or disaffected magical beings, which tells you how broadly dissatisfaction was spreading. Then came the Rebellion of 1752, the most violently documented one. Although individual leaders aren't named in canon, ministry records from this era suggest the goblin factions were highly structured, with negotiators, tacticians, and combat units skilled enough that wizards actually had to rethink their defense strategies. The conflict pushed the ministry to create stricter regulations around magical creatures, financial systems, and wand ownership. Goblins responded to these restrictions exactly as expected. They rebelled again. Across all of these events, one theme stays consistent. Goblins weren't fighting because the wizards insisted on pizza. They were fighting for rights, wand access, and political recognition. Wizards, meanwhile, were firm believers in the philosophy of a ruling class, especially since they ruled. After 2 centuries of goblin uprisings, you might expect the wizarding world to take a break from large-scale conflict. Instead, it pivoted directly into another political dilemma, this time involving giants, creatures who stood somewhere between misunderstood and don't jump in the queue at KFC. The Giant Wars describe a slow, multi-phase struggle between wizards and giants that unfolded across the 18 and 1900s. Unlike the Goblin Uprisings, which erupted in clear, pointed rebellions, the conflict with the giants developed through a combination of internal collapse, external pressure, and a ministry that couldn't decide whether it wanted to negotiate, legislate, or simply hope the problem wandered off into the mountains. To understand this era, you first need to understand giants themselves. Historically, giant clans were well, giant clans. They were large, territorial, and not especially diplomatic. Their societies were governed by chieftains, whose authority depended almost entirely on who could pick a bigger rock to bludgeon their enemies with. Disputes were settled quickly and loudly, often by throwing said rocks at said enemies. By the early 1800s, this internal violence had already thinned their numbers. Clans fought over shrinking territories, resources, and leadership. Some records mention clans being wiped out before the ministry ever became involved. Wizards took this as evidence that giants were inherently dangerous. Giants viewed wizard intervention as yet another external threat. Early ministry efforts were focused on containment, a polite policy term that essentially meant pushing giants away from populated areas. Inevitably, this led to clans violently resisting relocation or retaliating when they felt provoked. Several such engagements are noted in later historical summaries, though, unsurprisingly, the ministry archives tend to phrase them as necessary defensive operations. Over time, the ministry experimented with diplomacy. Envoys attempted negotiations, offering resources or regulated spaces in exchange for peace. But giants were a fractured society by then. A single clan might accept talks, while another interpreted the same gesture as an insult. This inconsistency made it nearly impossible to reach lasting agreements. By the late 1800s, many clans had fled to remote mountain regions, most notably those referenced in modern accounts. Leaders like Carcass represent the final era of organized giant society. Small, weary communities whose primary goal was basic survival. When wizards, and later dark wizards, approached them, giants often cooperated not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. By the early 1900s, the conflict had effectively ended for the same reason the cowboys in America stopped feuding with indigenous tribes, because most of them died. The giant wars explain why Hagrid's lineage is so rare, why the ministry still monitors giant habitats, and why Voldemort later found it so easy to recruit surviving clans. Desperation often beats ideology. Actually, I take that back. Hagrid's lineage is so rare because the idea of a regular-sized human and a giant hooking up is ridiculous. The logistics of making such a pairing work physically are enough to give most people a headache. With giants pushed into the mountains and the ministry claiming things were under control, attention quietly shifted to the other magical beings who were considerably less under control. What followed wasn't a single war, but a long sequence of disputes that proved the wizarding world still hadn't mastered the art of peaceful coexistence. The creature conflict period refers to the long, overlapping disputes between the ministry and various non-human magical beings between the 1700s and early 20th century. These weren't your typical wars, but a steady pattern of tension-driven clashes involving werewolves, vampires, trolls, centaurs, and other communities the ministry struggled, often unsuccessfully, to govern. Werewolf tensions were among the most significant. As anti-werewolf laws hardened in the 1800s, registration became mandatory, employment restrictions increased, and public fear grew. Unsurprisingly, werewolf communities didn't view these developments as supportive. Some groups refused registration entirely, while others formed small, decentralized packs that resisted ministry surveillance. By the time Fenrir Greyback emerged in the 20th century, he inherited a population already shaped by 2 centuries of strained relations. Vampire conflicts followed similar lines. While less aggressive than giants and less publicly feared than werewolves, vampires were frequently the target of restrictive legislation. Ministry crackdowns, sometimes triggered by isolated incidents, tended to treat the entire population as suspicious. This created a cycle of raids, protests, and diplomatic standoffs. Vampires were capable negotiators, but the ministry's blanket approach often resulted in friction rather than meaningful cooperation. Troll-related conflicts were more straightforward. Troll communities were disruptive, difficult to relocate, and even harder to reason with. The most famous incident, the Troll Rights Riot of 1718, involved troll advocates pushing for better treatment, which unfortunately collided with the practical reality that trolls themselves showed little interest in structured political dialogue. They mainly wanted to sit under bridges, thinking up riddles all day. The ministry remained cautious and sometimes heavy-handed, leading to occasional uprisings when trolls wandered too close to wizarding settlements. Centaurs, meanwhile, presented a separate challenge. Highly intelligent, but resolutely independent, they consistently rejected wizard authority. Territorial disputes were common, especially when the ministry attempted to formalize control over forested regions. The Centaurs' refusal to recognize wizarding rule meant that even small administrative decisions, such as setting exploration boundaries, could spiral into conflict. The defining feature of this entire period is that the ministry tried to apply one set of laws to a collection of species with fundamentally different cultures. The result was predictable: uneven enforcement, repeated confrontations, and a growing sense among magical beings that wizard-led governance was more burden than benefit. It's not like anyone asked the wizards to take it upon themselves to rule over everyone else. Several non-humans specifically asked them not to. This period shaped all future magical creature policy. laid the groundwork for the fragmented alliances Voldemort later exploited, and explains why creature politics in the wizarding world remained cautious well into Harry's lifetime. By the early 20th century, the Ministry was still occupied with creature regulations, territorial diplomacy, and the occasional troll wandering into the wrong corridor. But while officials were buried in paperwork, someone far more ambitious, and far more dangerous, was building a movement big enough to reshape the entire wizarding world. This era marks the shift from scattered disputes to a conflict with global reach. Like all great societies with a superiority complex, the wizarding world decided the only faction worth going to war with was itself. The global Grindelwald War refers to the decades-long rise of Gellert Grindelwald, a dark wizard whose vision of magical supremacy was far more ideological and organized than anything the wizarding world had previously faced. Unlike Voldemort, whose power centered on fear and intimidation, Grindelwald built a charismatic, persuasive political movement, gathering followers not just through force, but through the premise of a greater good. Let's put it this way. If Grindelwald were around today, there's a good chance he would be selling red hats with MWGA, Make Wizarding Great Again, written on the front. The conflict began quietly in the early 1920s. Grindelwald traveled across Europe, forming alliances, studying obscure branches of magic, and assembling supporters who believed wizards should openly rule the non-magical world. His operations were complex and varied. Recruitment cells in multiple countries, covert takeovers of magical governments, and experiments into obscure magical artifacts, most notably the Elder Wand. By the late 1920s and early 30s, small-scale confrontations broke out across Europe. These were often disguised as accidents or isolated crimes, but the pattern was clear. Grindelwald was dismantling magical authority piece by piece. His stronghold in Nurmengard became both a base of operations and a symbol of the movement's growing influence. As the wizarding world hesitated, Grindelwald expanded. Entire regions fell under his control. Magical law enforcement agencies were outmatched. The conflict escalated into a continent-wide struggle involving political collapse, mass displacement of magical families, and the disappearance or recruitment of entire wizarding communities. Even the American Wizarding Authority, MACUSA, faced direct infiltration attempts. Throughout this period, one figure remained conspicuously absent: Albus Dumbledore. Bound by a blood pact, he could not confront Grindelwald directly, a detail that prolonged the war and allowed Grindelwald's network to gain momentum. By the early 1940s, Grindelwald's power reached its height, with his influence touching nearly every major wizarding population in Europe. The war finally ended in 1945, when Dumbledore broke the pact and defeated Grindelwald in a duel that became one of the most documented magical confrontations in history. The Grindelwald War shaped modern international magical law, sparked the creation of several intergovernmental alliances, and set the stage for the wizarding world's cautious response to rising dark powers. A caution that would prove essential decades later. With Grindelwald defeated, the wizarding world expected a calmer era. And it got it, for a little while, until Snaky McNo-Nose came around and messed everything up. A few decades passed before another dark figure rose to power, this time far closer to home, and far more willing to use fear as his primary recruitment strategy. The First Wizarding War marks the rise of Lord Voldemort, and the first systemic attempt to take over the British wizarding world through intimidation, infiltration, and targeted violence. While Grindelwald operated internationally, Voldemort concentrated his efforts domestically, building a network designed to control institutions from within rather than overthrow them outright. The conflict began in the early 1970s when Voldemort's ideology, blood purity mixed with personal loyalty, started attracting followers. Many early Death Eaters came from old pure-blood families who believed a changing wizarding society threatened their influence. Others were drawn by power, fear, or in some cases, the belief that siding with Voldemort was simply safer than opposing him. Voldemort's strategy was highly structured. He used terror attacks to destabilize public confidence, assassinations to weaken political leadership, and blackmail to force compliance from influential witches and wizards. And if that didn't work, old Voldy wasn't above Avada Kedavraing fools who wouldn't get in line. The Ministry of Magic struggled to respond effectively. Its leadership was cautious, slow-moving, and frequently employed the "maybe if we ignore the problem, it will go away" tactic that so many governments are fond of using. The Order of the Phoenix emerged as the primary resistance group. Led by Albus Dumbledore, it operated independently of the Ministry, conducting intelligence missions, protecting targeted families, and disrupting Death Eater operations. Many of its members, including the Pruitt brothers, Marlene McKinnon, Dorcas Meadows, and the Longbottoms, became key figures in the conflict, though at great personal cost. By the late 1970s, disco was dominating the music charts, and Voldemort had infiltrated multiple institutions, including Hogwarts, the Wizengamot, and various ministry departments. The sense of fear was pervasive. Disappearances were common, and many families lived under constant threat. The war reached its peak when Sybil Trelawney delivered the prophecy foretelling Voldemort's downfall, prompting him to target the Potters. In 1981, Voldemort attacked the Potter family in Godric's Hollow. Lily Potter's sacrificial protection rebounded his killing curse, destroying his physical form and ending the war abruptly. Talk about I'm rubber, you're glue, you know? Death Eaters scattered, some claiming they had acted under the Imperius Curse, others going into hiding. The wizarding world began an uneasy recovery, unaware that this was only an intermission. A decade of chaos, fear, and political uncertainty ended not by a ministry initiative, but by a mother who refused to stand aside. I gotta admit, I'm a bit jealous. Harry's mother was willing to take an Avada Kedavra for him. My mom won't even take my calls. This conflict reshaped the ministry, influenced future security protocols, and established the conditions that would eventually allow Voldemort to return, setting the stage for the Second Wizarding War. The wizarding world spent more than a decade believing Voldemort was gone, and the ministry happily operated under the assumption that ignoring the problem really did make it go away. That illusion ended, however, the moment Voldemort returned. Not subtly nor quietly, but in a graveyard surrounded by Death Eaters and a couple of Hogwarts students. Just kidding. The ministry still didn't believe Voldemort was a credible threat and accused Harry Potter of making everything up. However, whether the ministry chose to acknowledge it or not, the Second Wizarding War was unavoidable. The Second War began with Voldemort's resurrection in 1995, but the conflict developed in stages, sharped largely by the ministry's refusal to acknowledge reality. Cornelius Fudge, determined to maintain political stability, dismissed all warnings, attacked Dumbledore's credibility, and insisted that any talks of Voldemort's return was a result of mass hysteria. This denial allowed Death Eaters to reorganize without resistance. During this first phase, Voldemort operated covertly, focusing on recruitment, infiltration, and strategic assassinations. Again, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? After all, Voldemort would have won the first time around if not for the power of love. All he had to do to win the second war was try not to murder any babies while they're in their mother's arms. The ministry, meanwhile, remained preoccupied with suppressing the truth, which left the Order of the Phoenix as the only group actively preparing for the inevitable escalation. Members of the Order monitored Death Eater activity, protected key individuals, and attempted to intervene before attacks reached public awareness. The conflict shifted into open warfare in 1996, when Death Eaters infiltrated Hogwarts and orchestrated the death of Albus Dumbledore. Technically, Dumbledore orchestrated his own death, but honestly, the last couple of Harry Potter books are so convoluted, I don't think J.K. Rowling even knows exactly what was going on. To this day, I still don't know who actually owns the Elder Wand. Dumbledore's death removed the wizarding world's most influential defender and created a leadership vacuum. Voldemort capitalized immediately, launching a swift takeover of the ministry. By placing Pius Thickness under the Imperius Curse, he gained direct control of magical law enforcement and established a regime designed to eliminate dissent and persecute Muggleborns. Under Voldemort's control, wizarding society deteriorated quicker than his nose. Families disappeared, the Trace was weaponized for surveillance, and Hogwarts transformed into a hostile environment under the Carrow's authority. Resistance emerged in multiple forms. The reformed Dumbledore's army, covert operations by remaining Order members, and small acts of defiance from citizens who refused to bow to their new sneaky overlord. The final phase of the war unfolded at Hogwarts in 1998. The Battle of Hogwarts brought together students, professors, magical creatures, and multiple resistance groups in a unified stand against Voldemort. Encounters such as the duel between Molly Weasley and Bellatrix Lestrange, and Neville Longbottom's destruction of Nagini, became defining moments. The confrontation ended when Harry willingly faced death, invoking the same protective magic Lily Potter once used. Voldemort's final curse rebounded, ending the war and dismantling his movement. And to think, it was all because of the wussiest spell they teach at Hogwarts, Expelliarmus. The fall of Voldemort ended Britain's most dangerous magical conflict, but it didn't create instant harmony. The wizarding world entered a fragile recovery period, and several long-standing issues, ones the war had conveniently pushed into the background, resurfaced almost immediately. What followed wasn't another war per se, but a collection of political, social, and territorial disputes. It's hard to call house elves needing rights and a few upset werewolves a war after the gravity of what went down with Lord Moldesnort, aka Tom Rizzler, so we'll just call them conflicts. One of the most complex challenges involved werewolf relations. Greyback's faction had committed numerous atrocities, but not all werewolves had supported him. Some had been forced into his pack. Others were victims of long-standing discrimination that narrowed their choices. After the war, the ministry publicly encouraged reintegration, Yet many of the restrictive laws that created the original divide remained in place. This produced a quiet internal conflict. Werewolves seeking fair treatment faced a system still shaped by fear, while others withdrew entirely from wizarding society, convinced genuine acceptance was impossible. Next were the goblins, whose relationship with the ministry was equally strained. The war had exposed weaknesses in wizarding leadership, and the break-in at Gringotts reinforced goblin concerns about security, autonomy, and the right to order takeout that wasn't circle-shaped and covered in fungus and cured meat. Though no rebellion followed, shockingly, negotiations became noticeably sharper. Goblins pushed for greater independence in financial matters and continued to challenge the long-standing laws governing wand ownership. Centaurs, meanwhile, returned to their usual isolation. Their brief cooperation during the Battle of Hogwarts didn't extend beyond the final confrontation. Afterwards, they reaffirmed their independence from wizarding governance and continued to enforce strict territorial boundaries within the Forbidden Forest. Any ministry attempt to regulate or monitor those areas risked immediate conflict, creating an ongoing territorial standoff. Inside the ministry itself, institutional reconstruction became a conflict of its own. Departments needed restructuring, security protocols required rewriting, and the public demanded accountability. Disagreements over creature rights, law enforcement, and international cooperation produced frequent internal clashes, although none escalated beyond political dispute. Finally, the House Elf rights movement reemerged. Post-war reflection, combined with growing awareness of elf servitude, sparked debates around labor, autonomy, and long-standing cultural norms. Progress was gradual and often met with resistance, but it represented a shift in wizarding society that could no longer be ignored. Together, these tensions defined the post-war era, a period less dramatic than Voldemort's rise, but equally important in determining how the wizarding world would move forward. If you want to see the other side of wizarding history, the groups who operated in the shadows while all these wars unfolded, move on to All 17 Secret Organizations in Harry Potter Explained in Detail.